The galaxy had been under the unchallenged rule of the Turnak for centuries. They were an advanced species whose fleets stretched across countless star systems with technology so far beyond the understanding of most other races that the idea of resistance seemed absurd. No one had dared to rise against them. Not in millennia, no rebellion, no uprising, not even a whisper of defiance had ever been heard. They crushed every threat before it could even grow into something that could challenge their dominance, and they had ruled with an iron fist, without fear of consequence or opposition. Yet on the edges of their vast empire something was happening, something that they didn't notice at first. The sensors of their border defense stations pinged faintly, an anomaly too small to be considered a threat, a single ship, one that didn't match any of their known records or classifications. It was too far out in the outskirts to be of concern, and the Turnak fleet commanders dismissed it entirely. Perhaps it was a stray scout ship from some distant world, perhaps it was nothing at all. But then it didn't disappear, it didn't move away, it simply lingered. It was odd, and that was what caught their attention at first. But the Turnak were used to oddities. Some rogue ships did come and go without explanation, and they'd grown accustomed to ignoring them. So when the strange ship made no move to advance or retreat, the Turnak leadership assumed it was of no consequence, at least not until their patrol ships started reporting that this tiny human warship had somehow evaded detection when it was not supposed to be able to, and not just that, it appeared to have a unique method of stealth that even their sophisticated systems couldn't decipher. This started to pique the curiosity of the Turnak generals and scientists, who had been so secure in their empire's superiority, their confidence unshakable. It was almost laughable to them that a single human ship had made it this far unnoticed into their domain. They were so used to being invincible that they could hardly fathom that anything could pose a threat to their control. But the more they looked into the ship, the more they couldn't explain it. The technology seemed unfamiliar to them. In fact, it seemed almost primitive compared to their own, but somehow it was still managing to evade their sensors and outmaneuver their surveillance. The ship was a mystery, and the more they tried to understand it, the more perplexing it became. Some in the Turnak Council began to question why a single human ship would even dare enter their domain. The majority laughed it off, thinking it was a mistake, or perhaps some foolish human that had wandered too far from their own territory. There was no real reason to worry, yet despite their dismissals, the ship continued to linger on the outskirts of their empire. No retreat, no progress, just waiting. For now, the Turnak did nothing. Their generals ordered their ships to ignore the intruder and carry on with their duties. They were secure in their strength, and they thought one lone ship would be no match for their superior might. But little did they know this one human warship was about to change everything. The Turnak Council met in their grand chambers, their massive and imposing forms gathered around a central table made of obsidian and holographic displays, their eyes glowing with a cold intelligence. They discussed the strange human ship in the same tone one might use to discuss a minor inconvenience, a trivial matter. The ship was still at the edge of their territory, drifting aimlessly, as if lost or simply waiting. They couldn't fathom why such a small, insignificant vessel would cause them any concern. After all, the Turnak had seen thousands of alien ships enter their space over the centuries. None had ever made it past their patrols or their border defenses. One of the younger commanders in the council stood to speak. He was eager to prove his worth and show that he understood the strength of their empire. His words were sharp and confident. He dismissed the human ship as nothing more than an insignificant stray, not worth their attention. A single vessel could hardly challenge the might of the Turnak fleet, he argued, so why waste valuable resources chasing after it instead of focusing on their ongoing conquests across the galaxy? His words were met with murmurs of agreement, but not everyone in the room was so certain. A few of the older commanders, their eyes clouded with experience, spoke more cautiously. One of them, a war veteran who had led the Turnak forces for decades, leaned forward and voiced a concern that seemed almost laughable to the others. He suggested that they should take a closer look at the ship just in case. The room fell silent at his words. Some chuckled under their breath, others exchanged skeptical glances, but the veteran persisted, reminding them that they had not faced a challenge like this in centuries, and that the unexpected often came from the most unlikely of sources. It wasn't that he believed the human ship posed a threat, but the sheer fact that it had evaded their detection was troubling. Finally, the leader of the council, an ancient Turnak, whose name had been whispered in awe across the galaxy, raised his hand, silencing the room. His gaze was sharp and calculating. He had ruled for longer than most could remember, and he had seen empires rise and fall. He had crushed civilizations without effort and brought entire star systems to their knees. He looked at the displays showing the human ship and nodded slowly. "Send a warning message," he said, his voice calm and firm. "If it is a mistake, they will retreat. If it is a challenge, we will crush it swiftly." The commanders nodded and agreed the decision was made. The message would be sent, an ultimatum demanding the human ship leave their space at once or face the consequences. And so the Vanguard received its first message from the Turnak, an official warning full of arrogance and confidence that spoke of their power and their dominance. It was short and to the point, but the tone was clear: leave now or be destroyed. But the humans did not retreat. They did not flee in fear as the Turnak expected. Instead, they responded with a single simple statement: "We will not leave until you surrender." The message was direct, almost laughable to the Turnak. They had never been challenged like this in all their existence, yet something about the words struck a chord deep within their collective minds, something they couldn't explain, a feeling of uncertainty they had no answers for. But there was no time for hesitation. The Turnak fleet was mobilizing now, and the real test was about to begin. The Turnak fleet moved swiftly toward the human vessel, its commanders confident that this would be a brief encounter, a mere formality. The arrogant dismissal of the single human ship now felt almost beneath them. They expected to crush it within minutes and return to their ongoing conquests without further thought to this insignificant intrusion. But as the fleet advanced closer to the Vanguard, something strange happened. The ship didn't flee, nor did it attempt to engage directly. Instead, it seemed to be toying with them, darting in and out of their sensor range, slipping through the smallest gaps between their patrols like a shadow in the dark. It was maddening how elusive it was. They'd never faced anything quite like it. Commander Zikar of the Turnak fleet was among the first to experience the frustration. Personally, he barked orders to his fleet, demanding they encircle the ship and close in on it. Yet every time they attempted to trap it, the human ship vanished without a trace, only to reappear somewhere else within moments. The Turnak's sensors and tracking systems were working overtime, trying to pinpoint its location. But every time they thought they had the Vanguard cornered, it slipped away without a trace. Then came the first strike. The Turnak thought they were prepared for anything, but they hadn't expected this. The Vanguard launched a series of precisely timed electromagnetic pulses that disabled half of their forward fleet's communication systems. In a single flash, the Turnak ships were thrown into chaos as they lost contact with one another for brief but critical moments. And in that split second, the Vanguard struck again. Its powerful weapon systems locked onto a Turnak flagship and fired a series of piercing laser blasts. The Turnak flagship's shields flickered, but held. It wasn't enough to cripple it completely, but the attack was a wake-up call for the Turnak. The human ship wasn't here to run or retreat, it was here to fight. For the next several hours, the battle raged in the outer fringes of Turnak space. The Vanguard danced through the Turnak fleet, striking with pinpoint accuracy before vanishing once again. Before they could retaliate, each move seemed planned with military precision, almost as if the humans had studied them and understood their weaknesses better than they themselves did. The Turnak ships were strong but slow, compared to the human vessel, whose small size and exceptional maneuverability made it nearly impossible to catch, let alone destroy. The Vanguard was outsmarting them at every turn. It was a game of cat and mouse, but the Turnak were beginning to realize that they were the mice. Zikar issued commands in a growing frenzy, his tactics growing more desperate. But no matter how he arranged his forces, the Vanguard was always one step ahead. Then came the second strike, a devastating blow that shook the confidence of the Turnak to its core. The Vanguard launched a series of precision torpedoes, aimed at the weakest points in their defense grids. The Turnak fleet was crippled further, and now their once proud ships were drifting in the cold emptiness of space with no way to communicate or organize. It was the first time in centuries that the Turnak had been caught off guard by a threat they couldn't predict, or overpower. Their arrogance had blinded them to the fact that the humans weren't just another species to be swept aside. They were something new, something different, and now they were going to have to face the reality of that challenge. The Turnak began to retreat, but not without casualties, not without the sting of a lost battle on their records, something they couldn't ignore, not anymore. Back on the Turnak homeworld, the mood was grim. The council had convened once again, and for the first time in centuries, the once unshakable confidence of the Turnak leadership was clouded with doubt. The fleet had suffered significant damage in a way that defied explanation. It wasn't supposed to happen, not to them. For all their superior technology, for all their dominance, they had been outmaneuvered, outfought, and outpaced by a single human ship. The defeat stung, not because of the physical loss, but because it challenged everything they believed about their empire's invincibility. Councillor Volker, one of the more seasoned members of the leadership, slammed his fist on the table, his voice laced with fury. "How could this happen?" he demanded, his multiple eyes narrowing in disbelief. "We've seen galaxies fall to our might, civilizations crushed under our heel, and now a single human vessel dares tow." He cut himself off, breathing heavily, his frustration boiling over. There was a long silence as the rest of the council absorbed his words, none of them willing to admit their own unease. Commander Zakar, whose fleet had been routed, stood at attention, looking more like a prisoner than a military leader. His pride had been shattered, and the weight of his failure was obvious. He had never anticipated such an outcome. The Turnak had always relied on their overwhelming power, and this anomaly had exposed a flaw they couldn't afford. "Perhaps we were too confident," Zakar muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps we underestimated them. This ship, it isn't like anything we've seen before. It adapts, it calculates, it seems to know what we will do before we do it. It's almost as if they've studied us." Another member of the council, a younger and more aggressive Turnak, rose to his feet. His voice was sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. "This is absurd. We are Turnak. A single ship cannot pose a threat to us. We should not cower in fear of this human vessel. We should strike with all our might and erase it from existence." The older members exchanged wary glances. They could feel the impatience in the air, but there was a palpable hesitation among them. They had fought wars across the galaxy, but never had they faced such an unpredictable foe. No other species had ever been able to so precisely target their weaknesses, much less evade their military might with such ease. Finally, the council leader, Daktar, the most ancient and revered of them all, spoke. His voice was calm, yet his words carried the weight of centuries of wisdom. "We must be cautious. We cannot ignore the threat they represent. If we strike too quickly, we may provoke something far worse. If this human ship can cause this much damage, imagine what they might be capable of with more time." There was an uneasy murmur around the table. Daktar's eyes glowed with an eerie wisdom, one that had guided the Empire through countless victories. "Send a message," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Not of threats, but of understanding. Offer them a path to retreat if they agree to leave our space. They may be foolish, but they are not beyond reasoning." It was a message that sent ripples through the council, a move toward diplomacy, not destruction. It was a step that none of them had ever imagined taking in the face of an enemy. But Daktar was right. The Turnak had never faced an opponent that fought with such unpredictability, such resourcefulness. For the first time, they had no idea how this would play out. As the message was sent, the council waited, uneasy, unsure of what would come next. What they hadn't yet realized, however, was that this small human ship had already begun to change the very nature of their empire. The Turnak were no longer the unquestioned rulers of the galaxy. and the humans weren't going to back down. Commander Riley stood on the bridge of the Vanguard, her eyes locked onto the view screen as the stars outside streaked by in a blur. The Turnak's message had been received, but Riley didn't give it a second thought. She'd expected as much. The Turnak were powerful, yes, but they were predictable, arrogant, and far too complacent in their own superiority. She'd watched their fleet retreat, feeling their uncertainty ripple through the communication channels. The Turnak were beginning to realize that the human ship they had dismissed as an anomaly wasn't something to be ignored. The crew around her remained focused, working quickly as they adjusted their strategies for the next phase. Riley knew that this was the moment of truth. She had drawn the Turnak's attention, and they were responding. But what they didn't realize was that they were already on the back foot. Riley's plans weren't about brute force. They were about creating a shift, a crack in the armor of the Turnak Empire that could be exploited by others. If humanity could show that even a small, isolated ship could make the galaxy's greatest power bleed, then the entire galaxy would start to look differently at the Turnak. "Commander, the Turnak are amassing another fleet," reported Lieutenant Harris, his voice steady despite the urgency in the air. "They're not sending a full force, but it's enough to cause a significant disruption if we don't act." Riley turned to face her crew, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Prepare to engage. Let's give them a reason to rethink their arrogance." The Vanguard wasn't the largest or most heavily armed ship in the galaxy, but it was fast, stealthy, and most importantly, adaptable. Riley's crew had made sure of that. Every system had been optimized for hit-and-run tactics, creating havoc wherever they went. The Turnak didn't understand the scale of the fight that was coming for them, nor did they realize that humanity wasn't simply fighting for survival. They were fighting for relevance, for a place among the stars. With a calculated move, Riley activated a series of decoys, launching them toward the Turnak fleet, while the Vanguard silently slipped past their defenses. The human warship was a shadow in the darkness, impossible to pin down and harder still to predict. Riley's tactics involved not just direct confrontation, but psychological warfare, make the Turnak question their every move. And that was something humanity excelled at, underestimating nothing and improvising when necessary. "The decoys have taken their bait," Lieutenant Harris said, watching the sensors. "They're splitting their forces to deal with the false targets. We can strike now." Riley nodded. The time had come to shift the battle. The Vanguard came to a sudden stop, hidden behind an asteroid field in the Turnak sector. In the blink of an eye, their powerful cannons targeted the Turnak flagship, their pride. With precision, the Vanguard fired a series of devastating shots, disabling its shields and damaging its weapon systems. The Turnak flagship, once thought invincible, was suddenly vulnerable, and the fleet commander on board was now struggling to regain control. "Now we move," Riley ordered, the calm voice of a seasoned leader. "Target their weak points. Focus on their command ships first." For the next few hours, the Vanguard danced around the Turnak fleet, leaving them confused, angry, and battered. Each engagement was a calculated risk, each victory a building block toward a larger goal. Riley knew the Turnak would retaliate with overwhelming force, but every minute they spent chasing shadows was a minute the Turnak lost. Humanity had not just engaged in a physical battle. They were waging a war of perception. The Turnak might have dominated the stars for centuries, but the humans were showing them just how fragile that dominance really was. As the Vanguard slipped back into the shadows, Riley allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. This was just the beginning. The Turnak were now on edge, their confidence shattered. And what followed would be something far bigger, something that would shake the foundations of their empire to its core. The Turnak were not a species accustomed to failure, and as the days passed after the latest engagement, their desperation grew. They had underestimated the human warship, thinking it would be no more than an irritating distraction. Now, with their fleet in disarray and their most advanced ships suffering crippling damage, The Turnak could no longer ignore the growing threat. They were shaken, their once absolute control of the galaxy suddenly looking fragile in the face of a human ship. And that terrified them. High on their homeworld, deep within the Turnak Military Command Center, a new plan was being drawn up. This time, it would not be a show of force. It would be an overwhelming one. The Turnak would unleash everything they had left, deploying their most advanced warships and their deadliest weapons. A final attempt to stamp out the rebellion before it could take root in the galaxy. "Prepare the supernova class," ordered General Krykov, his voice low but filled with authority. "We'll leave nothing to chance. Destroy the human ship and any race that dares to follow them." The supernova-class warships were among the Turnak's deadliest creations, massive, heavily armed, and capable of wiping out entire fleets with a single devastating barrage. They were the crown jewel of the Turnak fleet, feared across the galaxy for their power and impenetrable defenses. It was clear that the Turnak were no longer treating the Vanguard as an anomaly. They were treating it as the catalyst for something much more dangerous. But Commander Riley and her crew were already several steps ahead. The moment the Turnak had started mobilizing their remaining forces, Riley had activated a network of allies, small, independent races who had long suffered under Turnak oppression. Humanity had always been good at forming connections, alliances forged out of mutual need, and now was the time to call in every favor they had. These races, too, had seen their worlds ravaged by the Turnak, and now they were ready to strike back. The Turnak were about to face not just the Vanguard, but an entire coalition of resistance groups. Riley's message to them was simple: together, we can take back what they've stolen. As the Turnak prepared their final offensive, Riley deployed her strategy. A mix of psychological warfare, subterfuge, and calculated, lightning-fast strikes. She knew she couldn't defeat the Turnak head-on. She'd never be able to outgun them. But she didn't need to. She only needed to keep them off balance, keep them guessing, and make them fear the unknown. This war wasn't just about space battles. It was about sowing discord, creating distrust among the Turnak ranks, and showing them that their empire wasn't as unbreakable as they thought. And so the Vanguard struck again, this time with precision that even the Turnak hadn't anticipated. Riley's team infiltrated the Turnak's secure comms network, spreading misinformation that splintered their command structure. The Turnak fleet, disorganized and scrambling to reestablish communications, fell victim to a series of coordinated attacks. Small, nimble ships from the resistance forces hit their supply lines, while the Vanguard continued to pick off their weakened flagships, leaving them with no room to maneuver. The Turnak, already on edge, were now questioning their leadership. Doubt spread like a virus within their ranks. Would the supernova-class warships be enough to tip the scales, or would their very reliance on these massive, unwieldy vessels become their undoing? The more they focused on the big guns, the more they failed to see the human ingenuity slipping through the cracks in their once perfect system. Riley knew that soon the Turnak would make their move, but she had already started to win the battle for their minds. And that was what would break them in the end. The Turnak Empire was crumbling. It wasn't the explosions in the void of space, or the shattered remnants of their fleets that made it undeniable. It was the whispers, the doubt that had begun to spread through their ranks. The once unified force of conquerors was now fractured, uncertain, struggling to hold onto its dominance. And at the heart of this shift stood the Vanguard, the single human warship that had thrown their entire galactic empire into disarray. On the bridge of the Vanguard, Commander Riley stood with a cold determination. The battle had been relentless, but the resistance was growing stronger. More ships had joined the coalition, more systems were rising up, emboldened by the victories that humanity's lone warship had inspired. It had started as a spark, but now it was ablaze. The Turnak might still be the most powerful force in the galaxy, but for the first time in centuries, they were no longer invincible. "Commander," Lieutenant Harris said, his voice tight with urgency, "we've intercepted a message from the Turnak Command. They're mobilizing the Supernova class. They plan to bring it into our sector. Full force. It's the last weapon they have that could potentially turn this fight in their favor. Riley turned to face the holographic map, her brow furrowing as she considered the implications. The Supernova-class warships were the Turnek's ultimate weapons, and their firepower could easily obliterate anything in their path. The stakes had just escalated, but Riley wasn't about to back down. If they had the Turnek's final trump card, then it was time for humanity's final move. "Gather the fleet," she said, her voice cold but resolute. "We need to be ready for this. I want all resistance ships in position. Don't engage until we've identified their weakest points. The supernovas are powerful, but they're not invincible." The next few hours were a blur of preparation. Riley and her crew worked tirelessly to coordinate the final phases of their plan. The resistance groups were scattered across the sector, but they were now united in purpose. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about taking back the galaxy from the Turnek's iron grip. As the Turnek fleet neared, the Vanguard slipped back into stealth mode, blending with the asteroid fields that lay ahead. Riley's fingers flew over the controls, setting up the final strike. She knew they didn't have the raw firepower to defeat the Turnek directly, but what they did have was speed, precision, and a network of allies who knew how to exploit the Turnek's over-reliance on their overwhelming might. "We're going to hit them where it hurts," Riley muttered under her breath, her eyes scanning the battle map. "The Supernova's shields are their weakness. If we can disable them, we'll cripple the Turnek's main weapon." The Turnek ships came into view, the imposing Supernova-class warships flanked by smaller vessels. The battle had already begun. The resistance fighters opened fire first, drawing the Turnek's attention. Riley could see their fleet begin to react, their ships dividing as they attempted to pick apart the scattered resistance. And then, just as planned, the Vanguard struck. In a flash, Riley's warship appeared out of stealth, a blur of motion as it darted between Turnek ships, launching precise, devastating pulses at the Supernova-class ships. The blasts hit the shields of the massive warships, sending shockwaves through the surrounding fleet. The Turnek reacted too late, scrambling to re-establish control of their flagship, but it was already too late. The Vanguard had already struck again, targeting critical systems with surgical precision. Turnek ships began to fall back, their largest weapon now exposed, vulnerable. The resistance forces moved in for the kill, focusing all their firepower on the now defenseless Supernova class. It was a brutal, coordinated strike, with ships swarming the Supernovas like a pack of wolves. The Turnek commanders attempted to regroup, but the damage was done. Riley stood on the bridge, watching the chaos unfold before her. This was the tipping point. They had broken through the Turnek's final line of defense, and there was no coming back from this. The Vanguard had shifted the balance of power, and for the first time, the Turnek realized that their reign was over. The battle raged on for hours, but the outcome was inevitable. The Turnek Empire, once an unshakable pillar of power, was crumbling before the sheer audacity of humanity's fight. Riley stood at the helm of the Vanguard, her fingers steady as she watched the tides of war turn. The Turnek's Supernova-class warships, the pride of their fleet, were nothing more than floating hulks now, their once impenetrable shields disabled and their weapons systems shattered. The remaining Turnek forces were scattering, retreating into the vastness of space, unable to regroup in the face of the relentless human assault. The resistance ships, coordinated and deadly, pressed forward. The Turnek's arrogance had been their undoing. For too long, they had ruled the galaxy with a sense of inevitability, assuming their strength would always be enough to crush any opposition. Now they were learning a harsh lesson. No empire, no matter how vast, could withstand the will of those who refused to be crushed. Commander Riley's voice was calm, but there was a glint in her eyes. "We've won this day," she said, her words carrying the weight of a hard-earned victory. "But this isn't just about this battle. It's about the future." Her crew cheered, but they knew the truth. This was only the beginning. The Turnak were reeling, but they weren't finished yet. Riley's mission wasn't just to defeat them. It was to shatter their perception of the galaxy, to make it clear that humanity and its allies were no longer to be overlooked or dismissed. As the last of the Turnak ships retreated into the dark void, Riley opened a comm channel to the galaxy-wide broadcast network. The message was broadcasted to every corner of the galaxy, to every species that had suffered under Turnak rule, to those who had been silenced, oppressed, and erased from the stars by the Empire's might. "This is Commander Riley of the Vanguard." Her voice rang out through the void. "The Turnak are no longer the rulers of this galaxy. No longer will their empire rule through fear and force. This galaxy belongs to the people who live in it, and together, we will decide our future. The time of the Turnak is over." Her message was met with silence for a brief moment, and then the communication systems lit up with messages of hope, of relief, of defiance. Species long enslaved by the Turnak began to speak again. Their voices, once stifled by fear, now rang out in unity. The Empire had collapsed, but the galaxy had been given something far more powerful in its place: a new beginning. The Turnak had underestimated humanity. They had seen a single ship, a speck in the vastness of the galaxy, and thought it could be ignored, crushed without consequence. But humanity's strength lay not in numbers or firepower. It lay in their ability to adapt, to improvise, to overcome. The Turnak had thought they were gods among the stars, but in the end, it was the humans who had proven that no power, no matter how great, could last forever. Riley stood in the silence of her bridge, looking out into the stars. There was much work to be done. The Turnak might have been defeated, but the galaxy was still a place of turmoil, of fractures that needed healing. But for the first time in centuries, the galaxy wasn't ruled by fear. It was ruled by the possibility of something new, a future where every species could have a say in their fate. She turned to her crew, her heart swelling with pride. "We've just begun," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else. "This galaxy is ours now. Let's make sure it stays that way."